Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and also want to thank Roberta and Howard for making it possible for me to be here. I want to just start off a little bit because a question that came up during dinner. I don't know, it was $5 for lunch, so it must be about $50 for dinner. Basically, we asked the question, why did we get to this point? You know, what made you think of sacred space? And I'm going to be very honest with you and maybe a little out of sorts from what you might want to hear. First of all, I'm not Christian, I'm Jewish, I'm not particularly religious. So how did I get to sacred space? Well, I got to sacred space because as I was writing a history of cities, I was given an assignment by Random House that said we want a 50,000 word history of cities. And I said, okay, I'm going to do global, so I'm going to do it all over the world. And what I noticed was that no matter where I was in the world, what I was writing about, and that historically people talked about the religious aspects of the places that they were. And this was true of the first Dutch settlers in New York. It was true in ancient Rome. It was true throughout history. And then I started reading urban history. And urban history, particularly in the period after Mumford, stopped mentioning any of this. There's a very famous British historian who wrote a 1,000-page history of cities, and the word Christianity came up 3 times. And I said, well, that kind of doesn't really make much sense given what we know. And I began to realize that this sacred space had been one of the great aspects of the urban experience from the very beginning. And so that's really how I got into this idea of that it was there. So it wasn't like something that I came wanting to write about. It really wasn't my intention. It is what the historical work I did, reading the diaries, reading the accounts of the time, led me to. So that's sort of how I got to this space. So let me, I don't need to talk to that, do I? So let me just talk a little bit about cities per se. Cities were, from the very early period, wrapped up in this idea that they were sacred spaces. Jacques Ellul wrote, "For God's Eden, he substitutes his own." Obviously, we got kicked out, and then we had to find a place to go. And so we began to say, how do we create a kind of Eden-like environment? So the key element of the urban experience was recreating some sort of sense of order. Like if you go and read the early Babylonian histories, they'll tell you Babylani stood for where the gods descend. And when you think about a city, you think about what it is about that specific place that makes it special. And I can say as my earliest memories of growing up in New York City and my grandmother walking me through the Lower East Side and into Greenwich Village where she lived when they had a little more money than when they were in the Lower East Side, and how this place, the city of New York, had this sort of special transcendent meaning because it was tied up with history and where my grandparents lived and all the institutions that had been created there. So I began to think more and more that this experience of my childhood was very much also in history. So if we take a look at what were cities initially, what made them, I tried to come up with what were the 3 things. And the book that really helped me a great deal with this is a wonderful book called The Discovery and Conquest of Mexico. It was written by a soldier with Cortez. And he's just a private soldier, he's not an officer. But he writes about coming into Tenochtitlan, what now is Mexico City. And he describes it with 3 things: the temples, the marketplaces, and the walls. And I realized, well, here's a guy who, this was like Star Trek going to Tenochtitlan. They had no idea it was there, they had no idea what it looked like, and they began to realize, yes, it is all strange, but it is very much a city. It made sense to them. And of course, later on, they took the temples and turned them into churches, but the idea was that in the experience of seeing Mexico, he had the experience that Europeans had with cities, and that these were universals. And this is probably the thing that I most found interesting is how cities everywhere have these three characteristics: sacred, safe, and busy. They're sacred, they're special places. Every city, Burdell writes about this, has an identity of its own. It's always seeking to assert that identity, its specialness. So that's the sacred part of it. It's safe, it has to be safe, and obviously it has to have a financial base. So when you go into these early cities, what you find more than anything else is they were built usually around a temple, around some sort of sacred structure. And I think this is one of the things that we, in the latter part of our urban history, have gotten away from. And I think it really takes a great deal away from the kind of system that really sustained cities over a long period of time. Now, we think about the Romans, and you've studied in your Bible about the Romans, and of course in our accounts, the Romans are kind of bad guys since they burnt the temple. But the Romans, we always picture them, if you watch all those terrible Italian Roman movies, and the Romans are always doing bad things. But actually, they were a very religious people in their own right. They were actually very, almost superstitious. Everything had significance. And there was a sacred stone that was considered a foundation stone of Rome, and they maintained it. So when you talk about Rome, Livy writes, impregnated by religions, the gods inhabit it. So to a Roman, Rome had a sacred space. It was a sacred place. You couldn't substitute it. It's like, for instance, if you think about New York after 9/11, New Yorkers couldn't conceive of leaving New York because something horrible had happened, because there was no substitute for it. Well, in this case, they actually believed that the gods actually lived in these places. Now, the interesting thing is, when I spent a good deal of my life in Asia, the same principles in Asia. Asian cities are built on a particular model, what you might call a cosmic model, and they all look the same. So when I was in Korea, and this woman was taking me around Seoul, the capital of Korea, the old imperial area, was modeled exactly on what the Chinese had done. Same thing in Japan. That there was an idea that somehow the sort of whole world order was defined by how the place looked. So they called it the cosmic pattern. That these cities had this remarkable resemblance to each other, because to them, the fact that this city and how the city was arranged and how the central part of the city was arranged had something to do with how the universe needed to work. And this was a very intense feeling. So again, we also often think of Asian cultures as not being necessarily that spiritual in the sense that, let's say, a Christian culture might be considered. But they had a very strong sense of the city has to be laid out in a certain way. It has to have a certain appeal. It has to be connected. And they believed that there was this natural connection between the city and the universe. And this was very central. And I think they would find our ways of building cities to be quite inhuman and wrong. Now, as we get into the later periods, what we find is European cities collapse after the Roman Empire, and it is really on the back of the Roman Catholic Church, certainly in the Western Europe, that you begin to see the beginnings of urbanism. And this is always why I find, when I read histories, that it's as if the entire religious content of those places was completely excised. It doesn't exist. It's as if urban historians in the late 19th and certainly in the 20th century decided that, well, not only was God dead, but he never existed. And so they forget almost entirely that what role the church has played. And what's amazing to me is, if you go to a city like Antwerp, and it's sort of not the nicest city in the world, but you go into their church, you can see this must have been an amazing experience for somebody in the 15th, 16th century to go into a place like this. So these cities began to build, and almost every single one of them was built around a church. And as we begin to move on, then we start to go into a different pattern. And this is where we sort of, in some ways, you could say we went in the wrong direction. A lot of ways, I just think this was the evolution. As our cities began to change, we began to move away from a sort of a more theocratic kind of regime, and we began to have sort of the thoughts that really emerged with the Reformation. We began to redefine the city as well, as Descartes called it, an inventory of the possible, as a place where you could actually try all things. And people ask me, what was your idea of the greatest city? And to me, it's 17th century Amsterdam, because it was a place where every idea could be tried. And it was a city that had many great churches and great plazas, but was very nice about it was the way it was very human scale, and that people could come from all sorts of backgrounds and be in that particular environment. And this was a tremendous movement forward in humanity. And of course, you have Braudel, and he writes about Venice, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, and London, all as being these cities that were open to outsiders. So you start to see this redefinition of sacred space as being not just sacred space for one group of people, but for many different types of people. And this is also part of a very strong tradition, and one that we still have here in the US. And of course, we began to see the entrance of women, other outsider groups being allowed to be part of that experience, of that sacred space. But throughout all that time, there was this belief that the city was sacred and different. The degree of identification with the place was much greater than we see now. In many American cities right now, it's like the football team, and that's about it. And this is something much more deeply rooted, and this tremendous sense of the excitement of this place. So it may not be, let's say, in like Babylon, where there's a huge temple, or Tenochtitlan, where there's a huge temple. It's maybe several different places. It could be a streetscape. It could be a marketplace. But this sense of the sacredness and uniqueness of the city, what I'll refer to as Martin Buber wrote a long time ago, called it the vocation of uniqueness, played a very important role in establishing that sacred space. Now, we had a rip in urban history. You could take almost all urban history from the very beginning to about the 19th century, and everything kind of looks like everything else. In other words, I think you could take somebody from Athens in the 4th century BC and put them in Venice and in the 14th century AD, and they sort of still feel what the city was, because it was still artisanal. There was still the central role of churches. We had a completely different sense of what the city was than what we have today. The big change takes place with the Industrial Revolution, because then the city becomes a center not necessarily of trade and barter and ideas, but of raw production. And so you get this tremendous change. You get an enormous increase in the densities of cities. One of the really interesting findings is this one here. This is by a German demographer. The medieval town was actually much less dense than the city of the pre-industrial area, and then in the 19th century. We began to crowd people in at unprecedented rates. And frankly, a debate or a discussion that could be had is when you spend time now in cities. Now, I spend a lot of time in Singapore, and they obviously have limitations in land and space. But you go to China and you see these block after block after block of high-rise buildings. And you begin to see how this works. And you realize, is this where humanity is going? Is this what we're turning ourselves into? Where we're these very, very autonomous units living in little places? I don't think this is necessarily where we want to go as a species, but this is sort of where we got to in the industrial world. And Engels, I have my students read The Condition of the Working Class in England, one of the great books ever written on urban history. And he talks about what this looked like, what we were creating. And of course, one of the great problems that emerged, and they write about this in 19th century industrial England, is you also started to see the decline of the religious community. There was enormous increase in illegitimacy and alcoholism, and the churches were in very, very serious trouble, and most particularly the Church of England, which seemed to be completely complicit in the kind of oppression that was going on at the time. So here we take a look at what the Victorian industrial city is. And the reason I mention China is there are times when I'm in China and I see how people are living, and it reminds me of this. It's not quite as stark, but how people live and how they must get up every morning, and you know, even more so in Mumbai. I remember being at a friend's apartment in Mumbai, and I said to him, you know, I only see two types of birds here. I see pigeons and crows. And they said, well, when you were growing up as a boy, did you see everything? He said, we had all sorts of tropical birds, and you could hear hyenas at night. And the fact that that was gone completely. And what had we done to the urban experience to turn it into this kind of hellish environment? So we have had ways, how do we deal with this situation? And in the Western world, there are two basic models. One is the French model, and being married to a woman of French descent, I understand the French need for order. You know, there's always this conflict between my Russian inspiration and her French sense of order. But anyway, then Napoleon III said, you know, and it's great to be a dictator, I'll tell you, wouldn't be bad. And he said, okay, you know, this city of Paris was absolutely in terrible shape. It was dirty. There was tremendous problems with disease, and there was this other problem, which was that these windy, turny streets. There are a few left in Paris. Were very, very good. Every time the French decided to overthrow their government every 20 or 30 years, then it was very hard to go in and get rid of them. So Haussmann came up with this brilliant idea of making big boulevards. So when the French communards in 1871 tried to establish the first socialist republic in the city of Paris, the French government was able to move the cannons into the broad boulevards and blow them away. So it worked out very well. So as you can see, this was one thing. You make order, and what Paris is about order, and by doing that, they also created a hierarchy of spaces and sacred spaces, which of course, if you understand the French mentality, is very secular, but it has a sort of sense of sacred space. You know, the tomb of Napoleon, the Champs-Élysées, it has this kind of grandeur that you know you're in Paris, you're excited to be in Paris, there's no place else that quite looks like Paris. So this was one approach. The British took a very different approach, and this is the one that I think is most relevant to us. That instead of trying to create a secular version of the magnificence of Rome or Tenochtitlan or of Beijing, we're going to create it, we're going to go back towards nature, and we're going to recreate the village. And Ebenezer Howard came up with the idea of the Garden City. And as much as it may be hard to believe, you are living in an extension of that idea, which was it was better for people to live in little homes of their own with backyards and to be in little villages instead of living on top of each other. Because what we have learned is there are some very negative effects to that kind of extremely high density. And there was a great period of progressivism, not like the progressives of today who now want everybody to live like my grandmother did in Brooklyn. You know, she grew up in a place called Brownsville. I don't know if any of you are from Brooklyn. Anybody from Brooklyn here? Brownsville, I won't use her exact language because this is a sacred space itself, but she would say it was a crummy neighborhood then and it's a crummy neighborhood now. And what we said was, we don't think people should live this way. We think people should be able to live in decent spaces where they could go and enjoy nature, and they can live in a more dispersed way. And the greatest example of this, and what I think is the premier sacred space in North America, is Central Park. There is nothing like Central Park. I just took my youngest child, who's 7, to Central Park, and we're walking along, and we had relatively good weather, and we're walking along, and you just see all these fantastic buildings, and then you look down, and you're in this green space. And I thought Olmsted talked about it as to supply to the hundreds of thousands of tired workers a specimen of God's handiwork. And I think this is the greatest expression of what the ideal should be for how you would develop cities in the future. So this idea became very central to the idea of Southern California. And so just to give you a little bit of the Southern California perspective, Southern California was built not to be New York, not to be Chicago, not to be high density, but to be an archipelago of smaller communities where people could live with a certain degree of privacy and personal space. And this was really the notion. This is Los Angeles Express 1905. It's a population of Los Angeles about 150,000. And they're already thinking about how to build the city. So they built originally the red car system, which allowed people who were working in downtown LA, or working in Long Beach, or working in Anaheim, to live in a dispersed manner. And look, it was attractive enough that there's 20 million people here. Now, we in Southern California missed a lot of things in building this into a sacred space and into a livable space. We did not build enough parks. We allowed for large areas where there was no green space. We didn't take advantage of the fact that we have such a great climate. A long time we didn't even allow people to eat outside. And we didn't really do what Olmsted had suggested. So now we are where we are. Are we in a perfect environment? Does the model that we live here in Southern California, is it perfect? Certainly not. But the question is, where and how do we live? Well, how do we want to live in the future? And this is a great debate, and unfortunately, I'm in a very small minority in the view that that future does not have to be the super high density future. We don't have to live like people do in China. We don't have to, and frankly, I think most of the Chinese, if they had a chance, would live that way either. So here's one of the things that we have to deal with. By 2050, we will have close to 100 million more people. So the question is, are we going to put them all in very tight spaces, or are we going to let them live in a more reasonable way, in a way that's better for them in a lot of different aspects, which we'll get into? One question is, well, we're running out of land. Well, you can see the percentage of land in the United States that's urban. It's very small. And actually, we have more parkland and forest land than we had in 1949. A lot of agricultural land that's not very productive has been taken out of production, turned into parks. And then we should continue to do that. What we have done is by creating extremely strong regulatory environments, we've made many places in the Western world very expensive. This measures the number of years of a median family income to earn the money to buy a house. And you see in Vancouver, it takes almost 10 years of your income. And here in Los Angeles, it's about 5.7. So there are now many parts of this country where it is absolutely impossible for anyone who doesn't have wealthy parents or didn't rob a bank yesterday to buy a house. I mean, literally, how many people, even of my generation, live in houses that our children will never be able to afford? And this has obviously been in part because of the regulatory environment. So a lot of Americans are moving to smaller places. What we're seeing in the US now is that there's more people moving into the Great Plains than are moving into California. Because again, if you have high prices, high density, a lot of people will opt for something else. Now, where do people want to live? Now, it's commonly said by my urbanist friends, oh, they all want to live in the city. Well, this is a Smart Growth America poll basically about 13% want to live in the city. Now, I think that's a great niche. And if you've got 100 million more people, that's 10 million more people in the urban environment. Let's make it 20%, 20 million people. Boy, that's going to keep the cities busy. They're not capable of handling what they have now. But most people want to live in a suburb close to the city or an exurb, about 51%, about 35% want to live in a rural community. Now, a lot of them never lived in a rural community, and if they went there, they probably wouldn't like it. We're just saying what people think. So we have now people in power who actually believe this. This is Sean Donovan, our HUD secretary. We've reached the limits of suburban development. People are beginning to vote with their feet and come back to the central cities. That's very interesting. He's the head of HUD. Did he ever think of going over to the Department of Commerce and checking out the census? So we checked out the census, okay. And what we found is the last decade, there was actually more population growth in metropolitan areas in the suburbs than in the cities than had occurred in the previous decade. So how does this guy get this nice salary being completely ignorant? It just amazes me. I mean, look, I can see somebody getting up and saying, I think urban life is better. I think we should live in high density. And you know what? You want to move to downtown LA? I think you should. But the idea that you think everybody's moving down there, or everybody wants to live that way, or even anything close to a majority wants to live that way, is not a very good idea. And the problem we're going to have in California is we now have a planning regime in which they will force you to live that way. In other words, that they will not allow for any more single-family houses to be built. But that's a whole other story. Even in New York, which I would hold, obviously being a native New Yorker, as by far the greatest city in the United States. I mean, I don't want to live there, but it's the greatest city in the United States. I mean, it's a great place, but it's the weather's better here. Anyway, as you can see, in New York there was the usual pattern. A big movement to the suburb, a decrease in population in the 70s, 80s, and then in the 80 to 2000 period, pretty even between the city and the suburbs, and then actually more heavily suburban in the last decade. So obviously we're seeing something happening even in the most successful city with the best transit and where the urban life is most sustainable. And these same patterns can be seen basically in other cities. What's really interesting is LA is the one great urban center that actually has gotten slightly more dense. We started lower and we've gotten a little bit more dense. But you can see New York, London, Paris, almost all the growth is in the outer rings of those cities. So what happens to the city? And this is where we get back to our sacred space. H.G. Wells, who I teach a class at Chapman called The History of the Future, and so his books are also required reading. And he talks about the future metropolitan space, a bazaar, a great gallery of shops and places of concourse and rendezvous. That, in other words, what's happening to the city is rather than being a place for families, and a place of churches, and a place of business, it's become a gigantic entertainment center. It is a place where young people go until they get tired of living in a Motel 6, and then it's a transitional place, a place for the very wealthy and for those who service them. And we have what I call the ephemeral city. The mayor of Berlin, one of the ephemeral cities, he calls it, they're poor but sexy. I don't know why you have to have both of those. And my friend Kevin Starr, the great historian, a very prominent Catholic as well, he says of San Francisco, it's a cross between Carmel and Calcutta. Other words, these are places, they're unique places, they have some nice characteristics to them, but they're basically not going to be places that most people are going to live for most of their lives. They can't afford it, and it doesn't meet their needs. So one of the biggest things, this is what I'm studying right now, is what we're finding is with this policy of densification and with urbanization in general, what we're seeing is that the birth rate is starting to drop. This is what we find in Singapore and Hong Kong and in China, in coastal China now. Now in China there's a policy that makes this mandatory, but there's below one child per woman in Hong Kong, which doesn't have the policy. I mean, essentially, what you're beginning to see is as we begin to go through this very urbanized, dense model, people aren't having children. We are now looking at places like Taiwan, where about 30 to 40% of all women say they will never have children. Now, the problem isn't any one person not having children, that's fine. But when 30 to 40% of your population doesn't have children, the way the actuarial tables work, you have no way of supporting your society down the road. In Germany, you're going to have 2 people working for every one retired by 2030. Japan will be there earlier. It simply can't work. In addition, we have to think about, and this is probably a different lecture at a different time, we have to think about there being a society in which essentially the vast majority of the population of the children have no aunts, have no uncles, have no cousins. Think about that. And that a huge percentage of the population, particularly in the urban centers, has no children. The Washington, D.C., 70% of all women are childless. 70%. So what we're seeing is a creation of a culture without children. Now, I personally believe that children are the basis of the sacred space in terms of the home, that the primary driver of people belonging to churches and synagogues are having kids and trying to instill values, even if they don't have those values themselves. And I know now our religion, the Judaism, is a more tribal religion, but you take children out of the equation and there's just no way that religion would survive. So we're looking at something on a global scale that we've never seen before, and that is a movement of the population into a whole new phase in which not only do people have fewer children, which has been going on for a while, but they have no children. And interestingly enough, many of those people who have no children are the most influential in society. So if you look at Germany, for instance, the last 2 chancellors did not have any children at all. And children have their good parts and their bad parts, but but not having them is worse than having them. So now, is there any hope here? I think your generation actually has some very interesting characteristics. We asked them where they want to live, and most of the millennials will tell you that actually that more than their parents, they want to live in the suburbs. What I think tends to happen is they may want to live in the cities when they're young, but if they think about themselves when they're older, it's something quite different. And we see this as they get older, they tend to move to suburbs. They move to suburbs because the schools are good, because it's safe, because they can afford the space. And they go to less dense places. Immigrants are doing the same thing. Immigrants used to be overwhelmingly in the urban centers. Now they're majority in the suburbs. And if you want to get really good Chinese food, you go to San Gabriel Valley. You want really good Vietnamese food, you go to Westminster. You don't go to downtown LA for either. The other part of the population is the elderly. That's growing even more rapidly than the millennials. The elderly, we're being told, all want to move back to the city. We know for an absolute fact that is nothing but a fantasy. 90% of them want to live where they're close to where they are now. So what we're going to see is the suburbs become multi-generational. And the idea of being close to family is going to be more important. And I just wrote a piece for Forbes about the really big thing in housing right now is multi-generational housing, where you build for kids or for the grandparents an attached unit into the house. And again, we found that older people, actually, if they moved anywhere, they moved further out. So what type of future are we looking at? I think we're talking about a future that, first of all, is probably slightly higher densities, but not anything like Central City apartments. It turns out it's not necessarily fuel efficient either. We're seeing cities that are built more. This is Southern California, where there are many different business centers. So the whole way that we're taught urban history, that there's an urban core and everything around it is subsidiary, is not really true in the vast majority of American cities. And the commutes are actually shorter in Irvine than they are in downtown LA, because so many people both live and work in Irvine. Are people beginning to get on transit because of gas prices? Turns out it has very little impact. The big thing that's growing is working at home, which is going to be very, very interesting in terms of how people live. Basically the same thing. We had about 8 million more people traveling alone, but over 2 million increase in working at home, which is pretty amazing. Be about 63 million people by 2016. And it's very green. What's very important here is what we may be seeing is a movement back to my ideal, which is Amsterdam in the 17th century, where people work at home. If you ever read those, go to one of the museums there, and you see those wonderful Rembrandt paintings, and they're always about a family, and the family is working at home. This is a tremendous ideal of how human beings can live. And if we have a society where 20–30% of people work at home, the advantages for the family and community are quite great. And this is something that's happening without the government policy at all. And so we begin to see this kind of vocation of uniqueness, communities, people living and working in the same community, tending to have a greater identity. More people now living in multi-generational housing. In 1940 was 25%, 12% in 1980, 16% now. So it's been growing considerably. Same thing, and particularly with the elderly. And I also have hope for your generation, because I think when we polled them, we found that your generation really, like they say, relationship with family is their #1 priority. I can tell you as a boomer, that was not our #1 priority. Relationship with parents, forget about it. And relationship with my parents, I was going to Berkeley, it was 3 minutes on the phone, and my father after 2 minutes would say, well, what else is there? Anyway, about 85% plan to get married. It's very interesting, in Italy, it's less than 50%. So I think ultimately we talk about restoring sacred space. You got to start with the family. The family is the basis of society. Margaret Mead wrote about no matter how many communes anyone invents, the family always comes back. And I think your generation is going to be part of that change. And we see the beginnings of culture beginning to move into the suburban locations, and I think that's going to be very important. But what's also very important is if you look at religious attendance, and you look at people in religious schools, they're increasingly in the suburbs, because that's where the families are. And that's where we're seeing some very dramatic changes in how our society is structured and how we can revive our communities. So I think ultimately what I would stress is we're in a transition period in which we have moved so far away from the sacred space that we begin to have very little appreciation for where we live. We don't have a sort of unifying concept for our communities. And I think your generation is going to be the one, I hope, that because you're interested in family, because you're interested in raising children, that you will revive our society and bring it back to where it should be. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.